I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on depressive realism, and why I want to talk about what's called, what some psychologists call depressive realism is because I'm trying to, I guess, revivify the understanding of the necessity of negative emotions in the pursuit of excellence and a meaningful life. And so I'm basing this off of just a study that's been done that shows that whenever you ask people who are not depressives how people rate their appearance, their skills, or their performance, or their opinions of them, those individuals who are not depressive tend to have overinflated opinions. But then when you ask the depressive person, they tend to have a far more accurate opinion of what others think of them and what their actual level of skill or ability is. And in general, I think why this is the case is because whenever somebody is a depressed person, or when you have a depressive, their mind is honestly looking for threat in the environment or anomaly, things that step outside of the framework of their desired ends, and it's highly sensitive to things that are just poking up here and there that don't quite fit whatever mapping or picture that the person has in mind in terms of whatever ideal or goal they would have set for themselves. And so a depressed person is looking at the world as one big threat mechanism, and this has to do with the fact that you can essentially see a depressed person as a highly stressed person. But the reason I want to bring up depressive realism is because depression honestly can help you see the truth, because one of the things people have extrapolated from this is that it's hard to get depressed people to buy into illusory thoughts. And so if you're happy, and that's partly that's due to the fact that dopamine and happy, contented people don't really evaluate reality from a critical standpoint, because dopamine, unless you're, and it's not just merely dopamine, it's a generalization of positive reward, but I should just say positive reward in general does not really want to make you see something in terms of the ways of the things that are inherently wrong with it. Because you value the thing, it's a mediator towards reward. So it's going to mostly show you the perspective of the thing that is rewarding. It's also why people tend to find things cute, and why if people tend to find other people attractive or cute, they have a very hard time in realizing how that person is manipulative or dangerous. I mean, it's why people have the adage of a wolf in sheep's clothing, or people even write in biblical references all the time that Satan or the devil was a beautiful angel, because beauty, reward, and general the things that generally elicit positive emotion do not ask for you to have an accurate representation or just a, I suppose, sober evaluation of the facts of the landscape. Not unless you're pursuing a goal and you find that you're not meeting the goal. The positive emotion is driving you to key in and focus on that thing, but your lack of acquisition of it is being mediated by, let's just say, cortisol, and so you're not happy when you're getting it, so you're toggling back and forth between not quite getting it and getting it. So even when you're trying to pursue a goal, it's not purely positive emotion. positive emotion mostly shows up in the anticipation of receiving the thing, but once you get it, that's a different set of kinds of emotions, which are endorphins. You may not necessarily feel happy once you actually achieve something, but at the very least, whenever you go to try to achieve something that you value, you're enthused or animated, and you're not really going to reference what you're doing or even notice it or see it, not unless there's a problem or a threat, which we can just call an anomaly. Well, it seems like depressed people are just always responding to anomalies wherever. It's something that's interesting about extroverts in general, the difference between extroverts and introverts in general. Part of the reason why I talk about extroverts being an index for positive emotion is because there have been several papers to show that just simply because of how extroverts prefrontal cortex is so part of the difference, the anatomical difference between extroverts and introverts, if there is one, let's put a little asterisk beside this point, is that when you're looking at neurologically what an extrovert's doing whenever they're making decisions versus what an introvert's doing whenever they're making decisions, is you tend to notice that extroverts tend to use less neural pathways to make a choice. It tends to be harder to paralyze an extrovert in a series of loops of decisions about a thing. And part of the reason why this is because they are mediated more by the neurochemical norepinephrine and dopamine and the other agonistic neurotransmitters that come in the cohort of those neuroreceptors. And so whenever you're looking at an extroverted person, they are much more narrow in their focus, enthusiastic, and excited. Excited, enthusiastic, narrow, and because they're like that, they're willing to leap out there and try something quicker. Doesn't mean that all extroverts are just impulsive or something like that. It's not the same thing as impulsivity, so it's not necessarily impulsivity. Impulsive people, so the difference between an extrovert and an impulsive person is an impulsive person knows risk, but things are so bad that they don't care about the risk. So an impulsive person is basically somebody who thinks that, you might as well get it while the getting's good because everything's going to hell anyways. That's an impulsive person. An extroverted person sees big, juicy reward and they don't notice the other things. And so it's the case that whenever you're looking at an introvert is going to pay more attention to potential threat and failure. And so whenever you're looking at a depressed person, kind of like an introvert, you're looking at somebody who's just picking out the potential problems, and they're always looking at the potential problems. It doesn't mean that extroverts don't do that, because whether or not you're going to be prone to paying attention to problems and issues is going to be more so mediated by your levels of neuroticism or conscientiousness, which, I'm really not going to try to sort out because that's way too complicated to me, at least. And the reason why I'm bothering to mention all of these things is to say that whenever you're looking at positive emotion in the brain, it is not there to make people necessarily see what's going on, but to animate them and move them towards something. But the issue is that that something may not exist. But you don't really care if something is sufficiently rewarding. You don't really care if it exists or not completely. And what I mean by that is that, well, it's why belief is a thing, because people can very much so believe things that are not true about the world, and that's because people aren't really objective. And part of the reason why people aren't objective is because part of the circuitry that's mediating your perspective on the world is mediating you to move towards certain ends in the world. And about the only thing you really want to see is those ends met, or those things that you value maintained. You don't really want to look at the things that, don't maintain those values, or those things that don't help you towards your ends. You're basically going to sort the world up into things that aid me in my quest and things that are a threat to my quest or my goal. And you don't really like those things that exist in the categories of things I don't like. You tend to just ignore them, and that's a lot of it's due to your left hemisphere, and you don't really get to pick in the first place. But and part of the reason why it's like that is because there is somewhat of an evolutionary advantage to being that way. It doesn't really matter if you're objective and you have an accurate view of the world, so long as you do the right things that make it such that you're more likely not to die, you're more likely to reproduce, or you're more likely to win favor in others and more likely to be successful, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's why one of the things psychologists tend to notice whenever you look at high performers, they tend to overestimate or overvalue their actual performance, which is strange. Be it all or whatever. I mean, an easy example of that is Muhammad Ali and some of the things that, it's a narcissism or it's an arrogance, but that narcissism and that arrogance helps people get to some extraordinary heights. It's something that people have noticed, and so it's that the whole movement and positive it's one of those observations that leads that whole movement and positive psychology of positive illusions. Well, when you're looking at a depressed person because they don't experience a lot of positive emotion, or they experience enough of a certain set of emotions that make it such that they really can't experience positive emotion, they do not seem to have as many, let's just say, illusions about what life is. Now, there is definitely a a tipping point in all this, where if you get somebody ramped up with enough positive emotion, I shouldn't say ramped up, I guess I should say tapered down with enough, excuse me, no, I shouldn't say positive emotion, sorry. It's because I said ramped up, I said positive emotion. What I should say is, if you get someone tapered down enough with negative emotion, they certainly stop having this capacity to, or they certainly stop having this idea of, there's a sweet spot, I should just say that, because enough negative emotion makes it such that no one sees the point to anything. You don't have a goal-pursuing sort of creature at all. And in fact, it's the case that once you get somebody to experience enough negative emotion, they're very much so willing to take their lives, which is a very strange thing, Understanding suicide from an evolutionary standpoint, it's a very difficult thing, and so I'm just going to skip right over that. But my point being ultimately is that depressive realism seems to be an empirical observation. So it does seem to be the case that if somebody experiences a certain amount of negative emotion regularly, they tend to be more what we would classically consider objective about things in the world. And so I'm not going to say that objectivity and negative emotion necessarily are the same thing, but it's certainly the case that you tend to not do critical thinking whenever you're extremely elated or excited. And it's why whenever you're talking to somebody and they're trying to sell you things, they don't want you to think about things. They want you to be happier. They want you to like them, because whenever you're happy and you like somebody, you're not critical, man, and it's very hard for you to be critical. It's partly why, marriages and things like that tend to have issues, because you're hopped up with a lot of positive emotion and endorphins about this person when you meet them, but and they give you a few orgasms and so on and so forth, and so you think like the moon about this person, but because you're on such a high neurochemical cocktail, you are just not looking at all of the potential faults and flaws of this person. But eventually that neurochemical cocktail wears off and you just start noticing things about that person that you did not notice before. Everything from imperfections in their appearance to problematic factors with their behavior and their personality that you think, like, who did you become? It's like, no, they're always that person. You just were too hopped up on, neurochemicals to notice. And so it's the case that, there's a downside to positive emotion. It doesn't lead to you exactly being vigilant about, reality and so on and so forth. And so you have people talking about depressive realism because of things like this. Now, the thing I would say is the reason why I care about depressive realism as a concept in general is because I do care about negative emotion and its role in creative production, or I guess, creative achievement, creative production, and so on and so forth, because intellectual achievement in general, because I don't think really you have a reason to analyze something or pay attention to something unless you have a problem you want to solve. Now, it's definitely the case that curiosity can lead you somewhere, but curiosity doesn't usually lead you to investigate something, because if you're curious about something and you look at it and you can just piece together what's going on in an instance, you have no reason to continue to mull over and investigate and analyze the thing. And something too that psychologists tend to find out about mathematicians and physicists, people who most people consider analytical, is that usually it's the case that they're actually motivated by intellectual challenge. And that was something I found surprising, because, I thought, I'm the only person that just does math because it's actually hard. I do math and physics because they're hard things to do, or I do it because, it's not obvious. Certain things aren't obvious in your first observation of them. And when you really press into something like a concept like potential energy or force, you just find that it dissolves into a minimal action principle, and because it dissolves into a minimal action principle, you have a completely new way of formulating classical mechanics and electrodynamics and so on and so forth. When you go from electrostatics to electrodynamics, you realize that, holy hell, like hell if I ever know what an electron is actually doing. And when you get to quantum mechanics and so on and so forth, you just realize that reality is very complicated, and it's something that takes a while to understand. And even when it's the case that you have a grip on things mathematically, it is not always the case that you understand it completely, because it's the case all the time that things go wrong experimentally. So it's nature is not obvious, and so because nature is characterized in this way, it's the case that people who tend to want to do things like math and physics tend to like intellectual challenge. Now, there may be other reasons for that or whatever, but it's certainly the case that my point in bringing that up is that you usually, or if somebody really wants to figure something out, so take, the Institute of Science in general. So there is a very good, I wouldn't say good, but I would just say um, problematic claim. I don't like Descartes' idea of the role of truth in science, but it's certainly the case that most rationalists and most Enlightenment thinkers thought that the point of science was to prevent death itself, or that the scientific institution would become so powerful in its ability to understand and manipulate reality that human beings would have the power over life and death itself. And it's certainly the case that that idea and that ideology still exists, and it definitely exists in transhumanism. And I've already said what I think about things like that. But it's Judeo-Christian, so yeah, it's fundamentally Judeo-Christian. So it's just in a different form. But I mean, I've already said what I think about that in other videos. But my point in bringing that up is that, you know, even the institution of science is fundamentally pragmatic in its makeup, and most precisely in the sense that, you know, you usually do not go through the lengths of investigation, enterprise, and attention to something unless you have a problem that you need to solve that has a rather large reward or risk in not solving it. So, you know, you need to get the oil or you're going to lose in the global race. So, you know, you will devote the team of scientists and NASA and whatever and like all other kinds of technology to figure out where that oil is, or you need renewable energy if you're China or something like that to lead the, you know, global race in the renewable energy technology industry and so on and so forth. So you devote the manpower and the resources and attention and labor and so on and so forth to all that stuff, you know, to make it actually occur. You don't, truth as an end in and of itself is not something that's, you know, I guess germane to most things that go on in the world. That's not really why most people do anything. And so I'm not saying there's not people that, whatever, it's not really why most people do anything. And if you're looking at why people would care about the truth in the first place, or why you have something like creativity in the first place or achievement in the first place, the only evolutionary reason you can come up, I mean, I'm not saying these aren't why shoulds, these are just why do. So why is or why do. Not why should somebody be achievement oriented, not why should people care about the truth or anything like that, but why do people care about these things from an evolutionary standpoint is because if you do, then you're rewarded. If you don't, you have a higher likelihood of dying. And so, yeah, and that's why you have things like achievement or creativity be a part of human cognition in the first place, or imagination, or whatever you want to call it, be a part of human cognition in the first place, because, well, the world is a problematic place and you're going to need the capacity to analyze it and solve problems. And so thus, and, you know, you're going to also have to work towards those ends and so on and so forth. And thus we have these capacities as human beings. And so it's the case that, well, you have to realize, I think, that it's problem and trouble that make up the basis for achievement. It's the case that I think mostly this, I'll just say like outright that I'm somebody who deals with depression. And I deal with depression probably more than people know, and it's not exactly an easy thing to deal with, but it certainly is the case that one of the things that I guess, like come up with as a depressed person is the fact that I do tend to be realistic about what is actually true or not true. I think I can't be Christian or have beliefs and things like that because I am too critical. I think that, I can't have certain feelings about certain things just because, neurochemically it's just not possible. And most things I create or most things I make, write, or do or anything like that, I don't like them. Most of the math I do, I don't like it. Most of the physics I do, I don't like it. And if it weren't the case that other people thought I was capable, or, people have called me brilliant and things like that, but if it weren't the case that other people would think those things, I definitely wouldn't think those things about myself. And if it weren't the case that other people promoted me in an academic setting, it's very hard for me to do self-promotion because I do have a tendency to undervalue myself, and I do have a tendency towards, to some extent, self-loathingness. And it's the case that because I'm like this, I am very, very critical of myself and of things in the world in general. I mean, there's a reason why I make videos about certain things, because I think a lot of things are problematic, or I think they're wrong, or I think I take issue with this, and and so on and so forth. And that all comes from the fact that I'm somebody who is a depressive person, and that the tendency to be a depressive person leads to me to at least be more critical. I don't know if I want to say that that's objective, and I don't know if I want to say that that's realistic completely, but it does certainly make me far more critical of people, things, and ideas, and my own self and the things I tend to do and produce than not. Criticality is my first instinct. Which, something I've had to learn to definitely mediate, because that's not socially a very nice approach to things, and that's also why depression, people who tend to be depressed tend to have problems in marriage and things like that, because depressed people, even neurotic people, depressed and neurotic people, and depression and neuroticism have a very interesting relationship. If you make somebody super, super hyper neurotic, they don't look very different from a depressed person. And so it's the case that they're very big stressors on romantic relationships, because those people tend to be critical of things and other people. And so, that's not, if you want to be with your partner for very long, you shouldn't criticize them that much. That's something, or your friends, don't get in the habit of criticizing your friends very much, or they'll just disappear. They won't stick around because people don't like that, and so, my point fundamentally is that given I'm like this, what I've said to myself is that I have to really, really pursue excellence. Whether I want to or not, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't. That's how I see it. I'm going to look at most things in the world, and I'm going to look at most things that I do and see them as insufficient or grotesque even sometimes, or sloppy or something like that. I'm just going to look at it and think it's just, I'm harsh. I'm very harsh in my evaluations, and I'm constantly evaluating myself. So it's very, very hard for me to settle on a positive opinion about myself or something. And so when I really say that I value something, or I really say that I like something, I mean it, because if I think something's good, I mean it. It's not like I just think anything's good. It doesn't work like that for me, because I can't. I really can't. And so because I'm like this, one of the things that I know is that I have to, for the most part, strive for excellence, because it is only whenever it's the case that I found something that can honestly satisfy myself that I know I've done a good job. You know, it's a real metric for evaluation for me. If I can be satisfied with it, even if it's just for the day and even if it's just for a week or something like that, if I can actually find a point of satisfaction with a thing, chances are I've done a good job. You know, I know that. You know, even though I don't want to believe that, I rationally know that. And it's the case too that I play music, I play the guitar, and I write stories, short stories and novels, and I'm going to start learning how to paint. Now, I can draw, but I don't paint really, or I've never like trained to paint. I'm not a trained painter. I can't do fresco or anything like that. So it's the case that I want to learn to do that, but it's definitely the case that whenever I think of why bother with art, and you know, my station as somebody who, you know, spends a lot of time working on math and physics, it's just the case that I need aesthetics around. I need beautiful things around in my life in order to make it such that I don't really want to bash things as much as I potentially could. Nietzsche said it best, that life is best as an aesthetic experience, and I find that to be a very edifying maxim to have in my life, you know. And I want it to be the case that one day I have the kind of skill as an artist to put up my own paintings and read my own works and think that they're beautiful things. I can tell you right now, I don't look at anything I do or anything I say or anything I create. I don't look at it now and think it's beautiful. But one day, I think so, because I have satisfied myself in the past. So the only reason I can say that is because I have actually satisfied myself in the past and thought, wow, that's actually good. All right, that's actually decent. And I'll show it to somebody else just to make sure I'm not, you know, being like loony or something like that. But it's usually not. That's usually not the case. But it's definitely the case, though, that if I can make it such that I really can, I guess, like match the scrutiny of my eye, then I have truly, truly, truly done a good work. And so it's the case that negative emotion, I think, just because I do it in my own life, it's something that people very much so bastardize. And there is absolutely a point to the fact that, you know, after a certain level of, I guess, indulgence in terms of your negative ideation, you have to put it in its place. So most nights I have a very hard time sleeping because my mind is just completely racing with ideas, and I'm very much so evaluating myself and the things that I've done and the kind of interactions I've had in a day's time. And so it's a lot to think about, but most of those thoughts and most of that thinking is very negative, is very much so evaluative and critical. I do have to pay attention to those things because they tell me things about myself that make it such that I am rather good at improving and learning as a person, but none of that comes from a positive space. And it is also the case that part of the reason why I'm able to achieve things in the first place is because I am this kind of person that is always fairly critical and evaluative about self. So if it's the case that I have some sort of ideal or goal or end I really want to hit, I hit it. Usually I'm very good at hitting that mark. And so it's the case, though, that at the same time, if it were the case that I listened to everything that my mind came up with, I probably would have killed myself a long time ago. And I can say that with a fair bit of confidence. And so it's definitely the case that, you know, there are problematic factors to negative emotion. I understand why people don't like negative emotion because it is not exactly something that you can entertain without its risk. It certainly has risk. And I certainly speak with the devil on many nights and many occasions. Let me just be frank in saying that. Right along with any other kind of constructive negative thought. And I mean, they're not constructive, but I mean, in the sense that they can be useful negative thoughts. There are plenty others that are not useful at all, in the sense that it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I definitely have a lot of those too, you know, and it's just the case that even though, and I'd say 70% of all of it is like that, but, you know, I listen to it all because that's the only way I get the 30%, you know, and it's the case that I also listen to that side of myself because I don't ever want to deny myself, you know, I mean, I don't ever want to lie to myself that I think something's true that's not true at all, and I don't really care what that costs me. Ultimately, you know, the only thing I've ever learned or I've ever found out from denying, I guess, the things that most other people know or think to be true is that I found a new way or new mode of being. I've created more value for things in the world that wouldn't have that value naturally. Or I'm coming up with a means of maybe satisfying a system of values that hasn't been yet constituted and brought together. Maybe I'm not. Maybe the only thing that I am is just a madman, and I happen to stumble upon a certain set of useful tools, and in the process of doing that, I am just completely at a loss and absolutely foolish and naive in my ventures, and I merely build, you know, elaborate towers of Babel that ought to fall and crumble at the turn of any wind and tide and time and so on and so forth. You know, that's all of those things are possible. All of it could be for naught, and all of it could absolutely be meaningless. And I know all of these things constantly and at all times. You know, they're just models of the world. They're not descriptions of reality in the sense that I don't really think human beings can know the truth, you know, fundamentally. I think we can know certain things about the truth and so on and so forth, but I don't think we can completely know the truth or whatever. But my point being is that, you know, I see history as I see history as a stream, and I see knowledge as a process. You have to actually stake the coals and step out there. If something emerges, great, but it's not going to happen unless you actually take a leap. It's not going to become anything unless you really try to do something. And it's certainly the case that I know with myself that I have to try and I have to do, because most of the other things can't satisfy me. Most of what's come in the world and most that other people have done and most that other people have said, I mean, I don't think that it's worth much. You know, I have a very extensive library. My bookshelf is full of books, but you see a lot of the same names consistently in terms of titles. You know, I don't read everyone. Yeah, and whenever I read most scientific papers, especially papers in psychology, I'm very critical of them, like extremely critical of them. Let's just say that I don't think that, and whenever I read scientific papers in general, like there's like, if you read them, there's a lot of bullshit out there, man. Like even in scientific papers, you know, it's there. Most of what comes into the world is trash. It's bad stuff. But because there's no other process for coming up with knowledge and coming up with ideas, It is just a process because there's no other way it means for us to do it other than, the best guess in the day and correction and checking at night, because there is no other process. If it were the case that there were divine revelations coming down to man, those things stopped a long time ago, such that, and we've dared to venture onto new enterprises that those voices had no kind of say to speak on about in any clearer way. It doesn't seem like God left a tablet of quantum mechanics, in a cave somewhere in the middle of the Middle East that we hadn't heard of. And so it was the case that it became necessary at some point for us to really step out there and traverse the rugged and difficult road of intellectualism and scholarliness. And so if it's the case that you're someone who deals with negative emotion, whether it be depression, whether it be anger or anything like that, learn to understand it and learn to use it. Doesn't mean you have to act on it, and it doesn't mean that other people have to know, because it's definitely the case I have a fairly large enough viewership for enough people to know certain mechanisms of my thoughts and how they influence me. But I can tell you a majority of the world I actually interface with on a day-to-day basis know nothing about me in that way. They wouldn't have a clue. And so it's not the case that you have to ever really show people or tell people, but it is the case that you have those emotions to orient you in the world, to tell you what's going on, and so far as who you are with respects to who you want to be. And so you got to listen to them, because there's no other voice. There may not be any other voice in your life than that. And if it's the case that you're non-religious, there's definitely no other voice other than, that landscape. And so you should probably get in touch with it. And so I don't really think you can strive for your highest ideals, to be in a pursuit of excellence if you're not dealing with the darker, problematic parts of yourself. Excellence is not positivity. Excellence is self-mastery. Excellence is overcoming oneself. And you can only overcome once you've dealt with. And so, yeah, that's my video. It's similar. It's similar to integrating your shadow and so on and so forth. I'd say that. I don't know though, when it comes to the shadow, if it's just purely negative emotion, man. Your shadow, the concept of a shadow is much more complicated than, negative emotion, but it could be the case that if you're a Western person, what your shadow really is a constellation of the negative emotions that you tend to repress in your life, because you have plenty of incentives as a Western person to just be positive, to just drink the Kool-Aid, to believe the beliefs and accept all of the decayed historical notions that make up our society, Or you could buy into all the ideologies and the collectivism and so on and so forth. That's part of this, Western sphere. You could do all of that, and so it could be the case that maybe what is in the more shadowy part of yourself is that critical spirit, the real critical spirit that would probably burn house and home, body and soul, and all other else living things on this planet, because they're not sufficient enough. Maybe you need to get in touch with that thing. As problematic as it sounds, it's that thing is at least honest in its evaluation. That's the thing that I take from that side of myself. And should honesty be a value? Yes. Should honesty be a virtue? I'm not sure about that one, but I know it certainly should be something that's valid, that should be valued, and it's a contingency. It's a contingent value. If you really want things, and if you really want it to be the case that you want to be a certain kind of person, then you need that honesty. You know, if there's a little Agent Smith living in you, listen to him, man, because it's only by listening to him or her, whatever you got going on, that you may find the means to your salvation. And so, yeah, that's my video. It's been a while, but I just wanted to make that, and thank you for watching.